Good afternoon. This is your second lecture, week 2. This week you do have a paper. Your first paper is due on July 15th, July 15th. What I'm asking you to do is write a 1,250 word research paper. You need at least 3 resources on your research paper. And I want you to talk about a social reaction to disability before 1865, which was the Civil War. Pretty much all of Covey's material so far covers that. Also, there's some chapters in your disability history book that also covers it. So next week's readings do cover that time period. And you can choose any disability or multiple disabilities. My key item here is I want to know what the reaction is. So you can look at it on a religious point of view. You can look at the fact that many of them are considered supernatural signs of something, either positive or negative. You can look at institutionalization. You can look at the treatment of the mentally ill. You can look at how physical disability is so much harder in that time period. And this is before wheelchairs. This is when you could become disabled because you broke a bone because they couldn't set the bone correctly. Lots of people lost limbs during this time. That was a typical means of dealing with a disabling condition. There was no antibiotics, things like that. So it's up to you what you want to pick. Any disability is okay, or multiples is fine. You can use Wikipedia, but even if you use 3 or 4 different Wikipedia entries, only one will count. So you still have to have 2 non-Wikipedia resources. The format will still be MLA. If you have any questions about MLA format, let me know. I will post some MLA style books up there for you. You will receive a deduction if you don't have MLA format. It won't be massive, but it'll be about 5 or 6 points. You will also receive a deduction in points if you're below 1,250 words. So make sure you go above that. As far as the formatting of the type and all of that, it really doesn't matter. But if you want to make it MLA standard, it's Times New Roman font 12, double spaced with 1-inch margins around all edges of the page. Also, you will be putting the paper in through Turnitin. So this leads me to plagiarism. This is how plagiarism is handled in this class. First time you plagiarize, I will allow you to fix it by rewriting the paper, and you will receive a grade deduction. So if you have an A, it would be a B, 10-point deduction. Second time you plagiarize in my class, you receive an F for the class, and you will be reported to academic affairs. So I give you 1, oops, I'm sorry, and that's it. That being said, if your plagiarism is unintentional, if it's just a simple matter that you did it wrong, I will just have you fix it. As far as direct quotes, no paper should have more than 20% direct quotes. That does not include your works cited page, which is not included in the 1,250 word count either. So don't overquote. I want your own words here. I want to hear what you have to say. If you have any other questions about the paper, please feel free to email me or put it up on the discussion boards. Now, as far as the material, we're coming close to the end of the ancient world or the past. We're going to be covering next week that kind of the 1800s a little bit more. And we're moving slowly into the modern age. Disability, particularly mental illness, for the ancient age or the pre-1900s, was mainly looked at either supernaturally, they were possessed, or somehow did something with the devil, or touched by the hands of God. When we look at someone like Joan of Arc, for example, Joan of Arc said she's heard God's voices telling her what to do. In the modern world, she would probably be labeled schizophrenic and treated. In the ancient world, she becomes a saint. The other issue that we see as a difference is lead. Lead poisoning was the number one way that people became mentally ill before the 1900s. This is a big deal because lead paint. So people like Vincent van Gogh, for example, was exposed to toxic levels of lead. And that's probably what caused Vincent to go mentally insane. Nowadays, we see that and we ban the use of lead in paint. However, back then that was a common issue. Mental illness as a whole has not been dealt with well. The ancient world did not acknowledge it. And in fact, the field of psychiatry doesn't really start until the 1900s. So before that, there was no treatment or anything for mental health. The other big issue with mental health is women. Women were often accused of being mentally unstable, of suffering from, quote, hysteria, unquote. Hysteria in the ancient world was this belief that the uterus would detach itself and would move around the body, and that would cause women to become unstable. That's why women were denied the right to vote for so many years and the right to own property, because they were viewed as being too mentally unstable for those tasks. Women were very much abused by being accused of being mentally ill, and were often sent to asylums or even institutions. And oftentimes this case wasn't because there was anything wrong with the woman, but rather because the woman was trouble. The husband may have wanted a new wife, or maybe he wanted her property that was left to her, the dowry, or whatever. So oftentimes the abuse would be there. It's even worse when we start looking at homosexuality. Homosexuality was considered an illness in the 1800s. Before the 1700s, homosexuality was just something that happened. It was something you did. And nobody was ever arrested for it or looked down upon. It was too common. Often for men, it involved sexual relations with young boys. And we certainly see that all the way down to Shakespeare's time. In the 1800s, during the Victorian era, is when the stigma of anti-sexuality started to be inflicted, and in particular, anti-homosexuality. During the 1900s, it gets much worse. And there's punitive damage attached. The psychiatric associations, when it first started in the infancy of the psychiatric field, declared homosexuality a mental illness. And in many cases, people were institutionalized. They were tortured. One of the cures for mental illness for women, one of the cures for lesbianism for women involved being raped. They also would be dipped in ice water and or boiling water, and they would stick things in their uterus. They would give them a chlorectomy where they cut off the clitoris. So there was a lot of horrible things that were done to people because they were homosexuals. And it really wasn't until the 1960s that the Psychiatric Association said, no, we were wrong. Homosexuality is not a mental illness. And those with homosexuality began to be treated fairly and be given their rights, their civil rights. So really, it's a very modern take. Before that, that was often considered a disabling condition. The other two conditions you guys are going to be looking at this week in Covey is blindness and deafness. One of the things you have to remember about deafness in particular was up until the Victorian era, those that were deaf were considered dumb, not just because they were unable to speak, but they felt that being deaf meant you weren't intelligent. You basically had a cognitive disorder, and they were treated as such. And the Catholic Church, really, until the late 1800s, wouldn't even allow someone who was deaf to receive the sacraments, because they believed if you were deaf, you couldn't hear the words of God, and therefore you couldn't be saved. Blindness also was a big issue. For the ancient world, of course, blindness was really horrible. This was the world that didn't have glasses. Imagine most of you guys without your glasses. How far could you see? How much could you see? Very little. Then, of course, in the modern era, it's been a little bit better. But in the 1900s, in World War I, blindness really made a comeback because the war, one of the weapons of war, was nerve gas, which caused blindness. So this is when the soldiers that came back from World War I really started to change how society viewed blindness. And we'll read more about that in our more modern history. But know that for the ancient world, being blind was devastating, but also in many cases was seen as a gift from the gods. So Homer was gifted with this beautiful ability to write because of his blindness. Or, you know, they were blinded, like Tiresias in Oedipus Rex. He was blind, so the gods gave him the ability to predict the future and have a sixth sense, basically. So that often happened as well. So many times people that were blind were attributed great powers. Even in the modern world, we see this fictionally in places like Daredevil, a comic book character who's blind, but yet has the abilities to use his hearing in a supernatural manner. So you're going to be looking at those as well. I'm going to cut off the lecture at this point. I have a written lecture for you to look at. And of course, I'm asking you to do a reading reflection. One of the discussions is about eugenics. This eugenics is a philosophy that started in Britain and America in the 1800s and really was a definitive issue of the early 1900s and led eventually to Nazism. And what the idea of the eugenics is social Darwinism. The idea that we, if we're evolving, we could also devolve. And it was the idea of purifying the human race by stopping it from being, by stopping the possibility of a de-evolution through disability. So we're going to be talking more about eugenics next week. All right? Have a good week. If you have any questions, email or post a question. Good day.